get rid of this. I'll sit down if necessary. Feel free to ask questions, interrupt. I am a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative researcher. I used to be a quantitative researcher when I had a colleague who likes to do that stuff, and he would do the quantitative work for me, or for us. And we had a blast, and we did some of the early work on the link between social and financial performance. And we were lucky. We had access to data. I put up a presentation here. I actually have up another one on the intellectual shamans in case anyone asks about it. So, but this is what I thought I would talk about: stewardship of the future, responsible leadership, which is one of my current interests. So I also had a visiting appointment last fall at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and where I spent a month in Pretoria, and where they're studying responsible leadership. It's a Center for Responsible Leadership. And so I got very interested in this whole idea. And then I was invited to a conference out in USC in California on stewardship. And so I thought, well, these two ideas really go together. And they go well with the kind of work that I've been doing for many years on corporate responsibility, and more recently on thinking about how we take the current system and maybe begin to think about what kinds of shifts might be necessary for a sustainable future. And I just want to see if I can make this thing work. Talk about why I think we might need to change. So we live in a world, and feel free to ask questions, interrupt, have a conversation. I don't usually lecture. I usually interact with students, as I tried to do with your freshman class this morning, not always successfully. So global human population in the planet has quadrupled since 1900. And I'll show you in a minute what that kind of looks like. But the number there's 7.1 billion people on the planet now, and we're pushing the boundaries of many planetary resources. We have really convincing evidence that climate change is with us, and that is beginning to affect us, not in the future, but now. So storm patterns are changing, seas are rising, glaciers are disappearing, rainforests are disappearing, deserts are forming where there didn't used to be deserts. The weather in New England, I can tell you, is different than it used to be even a few years ago. It's wetter in New England where it's drier in the other parts of the country. There's I think it was last week or week before, a new IPCC intergovernmental panel on climate change report came out with very strong evidence, scientific basically consensus, as far as you ever get consensus in science. About 98% of climate scientists believe that human-induced climate change is really happening. You can be a skeptic about climate change despite all of that, and still understand that our ecological systems are being pushed to their their constraints. So we have collapsing fisheries. We have the potential for much more desertification. We have scarcity of water. The next wars will be fought not about land, but about water, fresh water. Plenty of water in the world, but only about 3% of it or 4% of it is fresh. And that is the scarce commodity that people need to survive, basically. So our ecosystems are, in many respects, being pushed to their limits. We have increasingly wild weather patterns. I know here in Kansas you're probably familiar with wild weather. We've been talking about the way the buildings are built and why they're as strong as they are because of the tornadoes. We've had tornadoes in Massachusetts in the past few years. This is not heard of. We have these flash storms that come now and just drop huge amounts of water on us suddenly. And we've always had thunderstorms, but not the violence that we're getting them today. So this is what I mean when you see these wild weather patterns. And we're in what some people call the 6th great extinction in terms of species extinction. Only this extinction of species is human caused. We are killing off species with development and with just killing off species for a variety of reasons. When I was in South Africa, we saw a lot of rhinoceroses, but they're really an endangered species. They're huge animals. They're magnificent animals. Scary because they're big, but they're in danger of being hunted to death, basically, as are other major big animals, all the big five in South Africa. We have inequity growing globally. Recent reports suggest that the gap between the rich and poor in this country is getting bigger constantly. And I read recently that there's two things that make systems collapse, civilizations collapse. One of them is pushing ecological limits beyond their capacity to renew. And the other is a growing gap between the rich and the poor, which creates instability, social instability. We have what I call a broken free market ideology. It's evidenced in the global financial crisis. It's evidenced even more dramatically and recently, not even more, but dramatically and recently in Michael Lewis's new book called Flash Boys. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read it or read about it, in which he identifies these high-speed frequency traders who are getting in between your order for stocks and the purchase of those stocks and raising the prices before you have any, in milliseconds, before you have anything to say about it, and just sort of taking away a share of the money that you thought you were going to spend on the stock. I heard Michael Jensen say, Michael Jensen is one of the founders of agency theory. He was at a conference I was at a couple years ago, and he said that he thought the whole financial system lacks integrity. Jensen has moved on from agency theory to thinking about integrity, how we create systems with integrity, and he's particularly obviously concerned about the financial community because that was his area. He's retired now. We have an ongoing recession in the real world. So we don't have real growth anymore. In fact, I would argue, and I will argue later, that growth is the issue. The idea of growth is the issue, or an issue. And we have a global jobs crisis. So you have a jobs crisis in the United States, and we know that during the great global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, housing prices collapsed and a lot of people lost their jobs. And it hit certain sections of our country worse than other parts of the country. But globally, there are about 1.5 billion youth who need meaningful work, what the International Labor Organization calls decent work, in order to lead productive lives and lives that are where they can support families. And the outcome of not having decent work or any kind of work is what we see in the Arab uprisings that took place. It's what we saw beginning to happen even in this country with the Occupy movement a couple years back. It's lack of social cohesion or social unrest, and I think we've only sort of skimmed the surface of seeing that. We have continuing population growth. There's, as I said, about 7.1 billion people on the planet now. We last year passed the 7 billion mark. Planetary population of humans is expected to grow to about, well, the lowest estimate I've seen is 8.1 billion by about 2050. But other projections make it as high as 10 billion. And if we're already pushing against planetary ecological resources, then what happens when you have that many more people sort of pushing planetary resources? We have a system, an economic system. So I want to talk about changing the system, the economic system in particular, and the business system, and the kind of vision that I would see us needing kind of to impart to our students, if you will. We have a system in which externalizing costs is not only legal but expected of business. So as many costs as you can externalize as a business, you do externalize. And in the class, I was trying to get the students yesterday to think about the idea of externalizing costs, and I was using an example of, farms where you have lots of pesticides and lots of fertilizer being put on huge swaths of land that are single crops, where a single disease comes in that attacks that, can wipe out the entire crop. You've heard of the idea of too big to fail. Well, this is the too big to fail of crops. And then you have the externalized costs when it rains, and all that, those pollutants run off into the river and basically contaminate the river and anybody who is using the river up downstream from where you were. So we have this system where externalizing costs by business, including social costs. So you've heard of the Walmart effect? So when Walmart comes in, you have Walmarts out here? Yeah. So one of the things that happens when Walmart comes into an area is that that the local community businesses tend to die off because everybody starts shopping at Walmart. And Walmart is notorious for paying relatively low wages and for hiring people on a contingent or part-time basis. And so the Walmart effect is that when that happens, because Walmart came in, all of the other businesses lower their wages. So that you have this downward trend. And so then people can't afford to buy the stuff that Walmart's selling very well. You have a system in which financial interests and the financial community, the financial business system, has grown to be about a third of revenues over the past 30 or 40 years. And it no longer serves the function of servicing businesses, which it was initially established to do, and which its core purpose really is, providing the capital that businesses need to survive and to thrive. But now it's fundamentally, as we just could see with the idea of the Flash Boys, the high-frequency trading, is a global gambling casino. So much of what happens on Wall Street is not productive in the sense that it's producing goods or services that people actually demand, but it's merely churning stock, playing financial games to, I don't know how many people from finance are here, so I'll probably alienate every one of you, right? But to make money for the people who are working on Wall Street and are already wealthy for the most part. And so, problematic in a sense. So Paul Volcker, the former Fed chair, has asked the question, what's the most, he said there's only one innovation in the last 30 years in the financial sector of any value add, that has any value add. You know what it is? You know what it is. You don't know what it is? You're a finance person. What's your name?
Ainsley.
Ainsley.
Yeah. I don't know.
Oh. You know what it is? You know what it is?
No.
Derivatives? No, not derivatives. Oh, no, which have zero value from anything I can figure out. I'm sure a finance person could tell us what the value is, but...
So the question is, that's the biggest innovation?
What's the only innovation that has a value add in the financial services sector in the last 30 years? You use it every day.
Digital finances.
The ATM machine.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You use it every day. Use it every.
Banking.
Yes, electronic banking or digital. He said the ATM machine. So that's a pretty bad indictment coming from the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, right? Trust, as a result of the financial collapse and other stuff that happened earlier, Diane probably is an expert on these things like Enron and WorldCom and all of the scandals we had earlier in the start of the 2000s. Add to that the housing mortgage crisis of 2007, 2008, and the attendant sort of issues that went with that. And trust in business is at an all-time low. Now, trust in every other big institution is equally low. So the sector that seems to do the best is the civil society sector. Nonprofit organizations seem to have some of people's trust. But most other major institutions, especially the bigger ones, have had significant problems, including, for instance, the Catholic Church, which had the scandals that rocked the church in the early 2000s with the pedophile situation. So most other big institutions don't have a lot of public trust these days. And we have this need for growth. And I was a visiting scholar at Harvard a year and a half ago now, and we ran a little seminar that we called The Problem of Growth is Growth. And we argued and brought a bunch of sort of opinion leaders together to talk about this problem of growth being growth and what that means. And in a context in which sustainability is an issue, the problem of growth becomes more significant. So I'm going to suggest that today the world is full of wicked problems. Now, wicked problems is actually a kind of a technical term, even though it doesn't seem like. Russell Ackoff, the great management theorist, called them messes. So wicked problems are very similar to messes. I love that language because it's so technical, right? But a wicked problem is basically an intractable, highly complex problem with many factors feeding into it. And in wicked problems, different stakeholders bring different perspectives to it, both about how we're going to define the problem and what we should do about the problem. And so if we're going to have a situation in which we're trying to deal with a wicked problem, we need to bring the system, the collaborators, into the room, the people who are involved in dealing with that problem, sit around a table, preferably around one, where we can interact and share our perspectives, because we're not all going to agree about what we ought to do about this problem. The other problem with wicked problems is that once you start down a path trying to solve it, it's hard, you can't reverse it, because it's a complex, chaotic system. You can't reverse it. So if you think about it, think about weather is a complex problem, a chaotic system. But social problems tend to be wicked problems. Predicting weather is a wicked problem because it's chaotic in the physics sense of the word, or the mathematical sense of the word chaos. And you can't predict, in a chaotic system, you can predict patterns, but you can't necessarily predict the next event. So if we think about what wicked problems might be, who's got some ideas about some of the wicked problems that we might be facing in the world? Poverty. So our definition of why poverty happens could be really different from each other's, right? Or what we ought to do about it. You might argue for, what would you argue for? Education. I might say, oh, no, it's about jobs. Someone else might say,
inadequate social
skills.
Safety nets.
Safety nets, right. And on and on. Everybody who comes to that problem might have a different idea of it. Another type of wicked problem?
World hunger.
World hunger. Hunger. How do we save the world? How do we deal with the world hunger problems? Sustainability has been called a super wicked problem because of its complexity, and because so much of our economic system is embedded in the problem of sustainability, and so much of our social systems are embedded in the problem of sustainability. So we, the world, face many of these problems, these wicked problems. Most social problems, in fact, probably can be defined as wicked problems. And yet we don't bring systems thinking to the problem to solve the problem often enough. We try to do it with Band-Aids. And particularly in the United States, we love Band-Aids. We love to say, okay, well, if I just, put this apprenticeship program in work, I'm going to solve the education problem. The education problem, my first book was called Not by Schools Alone, and it was about the education wicked problem. And it's a systems problem. It's got everything to do with hunger, poverty, lack of social skills, and lack of connections. It's a hugely complex problem. So these are untamed problems, they call them. And my argument here is that if we're going to think about stewardship of the future, and that means stewardship of resources and planetary sort of ability to support human civilization in the future, we need to, if we're going to be responsible leaders, we need to be thinking about how to deal with these wicked problems in ways that we're not currently doing. Responsible leaders in all enterprises, civil society, governmental, and business, are going to be faced with these wicked problems, because the only way to deal with wicked problems is to sit around a table with people who aren't like you, who are working in different sectors, and to try to collaborate, because that's the only way you get the system in the room, because in a wicked problem, basically everything's connected to everything else, and we're all in it together. So let's just think about this population growth issue just as one of these wicked problems, because certainly population growth could be considered, human population growth could be considered a wicked problem. So this is what population growth looks like. So this is 8,000 BC on this end, and here's 1,000 AD, and this is what, about, the 1600s, and this is basically the last few hundred years. So, observation? oh ho. When you look at it that way, yeah, it's kind of a striking thing. You see what's happened. Now, this is the industrial era that has allowed that to happen, right? So this may be, 1800 or so, right? When we started using, or 1850 or so, when we started extracting oil and were able to develop machines that could do work for human beings, making our lives better. So there's no question.
Well, medicine. Medicine.
Medicines, yeah, all of the things that we think of as modern society, sanitation systems. As much as medicine, sanitation systems have been able to help human beings to grow and in numbers thrive in this way. But that's, I mean, just what do you think about a curve like that? Those of you who are more mathematical than I am. Where's our finance person?
One of my comments is, even in what's that book, the Christmas Carroll book, right? So Scrooge talks about the surplus population. So this discussion of excessive population has been around for at least 100-something years, right? So is it actually...
He was talking about the poor, too.
Well, yes, but I mean, it's still, the idea is the world is overpopulated. So is it actually overpopulated? Even though looking at it back in his time, we would say it really isn't.
Yeah,
So,
Malthus lived about the same time as Charles Dickens, right? The Malthusian predictions that there wasn't going to be enough food to support human population.
Right?
But
we've solved that food problem, kind of. Notwithstanding, right? So we can actually produce enough food. It's just the delivery of the food that hinders us from distributing it to everybody in the world.
that's the world hunger problem.
Yes, but I think we are able to produce it, though. It's not so much a production, it's being able to distribute it.
Yes, and we could talk about that,
Yes.
but that will be distracting.
Okay.
Because we could talk about how we're producing, especially in this country, how we're producing food now and whether that's sustainable.
What I mean is the population problem a real population problem, even because even back then people were saying the world's already overpopulated, and now we're 10 times more populated.
Yep.
Are we really overpopulated?
Humans have shown a tremendous ability to adapt
Yes,
to problems.
Exactly.
And solve problems.
Yes.
And move on.
Yes,
As
and
they-
interestingly, humans show that ability in times of crisis. But this, although it's a dramatic curve, on our day-to-day life, we're not seeing a crisis, are we? So we can look at the climate change reports. We can look at species extinction. We can look at the food crisis. There is a food crisis. Or if there isn't now, there will be a food crisis, whether it's related to distribution or the quality and quantity of food or the way we're producing our food. And we could have long discussions about this. Would be a wonderful discussion for this group, right? But I'm not an expert on it. I'm sure some of you are more expert on it than I am. But I have opinions about a lot of things, so, so I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I talked to the class a little bit about it. Okay, so that's one curve. That's another curve. So this is inequality in the U.S., representing inequality in the U.S. and the United States. This is the percentage of income that's owned by, what is it here? The top 10%. Okay, so this is 1920, 1941. This is the Roaring 30s, the 20s and 30s. This is World War II and after World War II till about 1995 or so, 1986 here. Okay, so, and this is 40-ish percent, 40+%. Again, here 46.54% to be exact. Observations. Poor Brent, I'm making this difficult for you. Observations.
Well, Keynesian wouldn't like that.
Why not, Diane?
Well, my memory of Keynes' theory is that, with the multiplier effect, people who are not in the elite class will spend money, and through the multiplier effect, that will contribute to gross national income. But the wealthy don't have the need to spend, so it gets stuck in savings. And so that's one way to look at that not being
Okay,
development.
that's one way, certainly one way, and that certainly is an issue, because these wealthy folks here, the top 0.01%, right, not the top 1% even, 0.001%, they're not spending, you know, if you are living paycheck to paycheck, or you have, you know, if you're earning less than poverty wage rates, you are spending most of what you're earning, and that does have a multiplier effect. So that's certainly one implication. Any others you can see, just thinking about the shape of that chart?
Well, another big factor in the U.S. is the baby boom population that's having an effect on that, because what you've got now is a lot older portion of the population that have been saving for retirement. They're earning more, and you have a lot less that are contributing on the front
So a
end.
study came out a few weeks ago. Do you know what the average household has saved for retirement in this country?
Yeah, it's
We
pathetic.
got 27,000.
40,000?
Less than 30,000.
Yes, 27,000. Because I'm retiring, I know all that stuff. I've read all that literature. But it's scary. I mean,
It's very scary. How are
and
these people?
you can't catch up.
Yeah.
Because the way
Not-
you get the money is through the compounding effect.
Yes,
over time.
and we're not even, interest rates are so low that that's
Yeah.
not even happening
Yeah, but
anymore.
it's also too that larger block of people flowing through the population density are the higher earners in all organizations too, because they're the older ones, been
Right.
longer and all
Right.
that. So you've got that
Yep.
happening too, and they're being replaced
Yep.
now in faster numbers by a lot of entry-level people. So
Yeah,
that's causing part of it too.
yeah. What about this? Anyone noticing? This is, you know, the Great Depression, right in there.
The Gilded Age was right before that.
Uh-huh.
And then you have the war, and you have the wars.
Wars. Well, the
That-
wars,
that
World
eliminated a lot.
World War One is here, right? Right here. This is, what, the Gilded Age, right? Just before the Depression. This would be the Depression. So what's going on here versus here?
Middle class is thriving, labor unions have power and some negotiating ability.
Yep.
Then you got the baby boomers that came about. That's when all the
Well,
birth rates jumped
here,
in, and
yes. But, you know, here,
Everybody's building families. And
yeah, here you're baby boomers, right? But I'm a baby boomer, and I was a kid, right? I wasn't earning any money. I wasn't earning any money till here. Or, yeah, here, 1969-ish, right?
in the 60s.
So there's this whole period of time in which public policies were different and tax codes were different. And in 1986, we had the change of tax code that has created the ability for people to accumulate massive amounts of wealth, which is, of course, what was going on here and is what's going on here. So we're rising inequity. Let's look at this another way. I think there's another picture here. So this is a shorter time period. This is 79, and this is 07, just before the great financial crisis, global financial crisis. This top red line is the top 1% and how much their income gains have shifted over that period of time. Again, here's your tax code shift, right? So if you were to plot that, you know, it's a pretty steadily rising line. This bottom blue two lines, that's the lower to 20th percentiles, right? So the lower 40% of population.
That's despite the gains in productivity that whole period.
Well, it could be because of the gains. Where do the gains in productivity get taken out? Who do they get taken out on? I've often said in public talks that we don't, as a world, need more productivity.
Yeah.
As a world, we need more jobs, right? We were talking about that a little bit earlier. So productivity means more productivity in my company. Unless you teach the Cleveland twist drill case. How many of you teach that case? In which productivity is actually rewarded to the employees, right? So more productive work is its piecework. So more productive, they get more. They earn more of the company's profits. But it's a piece rate system, and not everybody likes a piece rate system. Most companies, when if your employees come up with an innovation that makes them considerably more productive, what happens to those employees, or some of them anyway? They get laid off. because, wow, we're more efficient now. We don't need so many employees, and employees are costly. Part of a broken social contract between people and companies. But gains have all gone to the upper, even the upper 20% here, highest 5%. This is the top 1%, this is the highest 5%. Gains are all going to the top. A steady erosion of the middle. And the bottom basically not going anywhere. One more chart here. This is human-caused carbon dioxide emissions. 1751, so before the Industrial Revolution. 1851, right around the start of the Industrial Revolution, to say 2001. And these are various types of emissions, but the total is the pink line that's on the top there. And another exponential curve. This is what, when Al Gore made his movie An Inconvenient Truth, remember? I don't know if you've seen that movie, but at one point he gets on what are those things that lift you up, like a crane that lifts you up, and he rises up, cherry picker type of thing, and he rises up. He's got a big chart like this, and he rises up and says, if it keeps going like this, this is where it's going to be. I used to show that movie to my students. They hated Al Gore, so that the movie didn't do much for them. But I use a different movie now that doesn't have the divisive character of Al Gore in it. But that's CO2 is partly what's causing global warming and the issues associated with global warming. Now, if you think that companies don't need to be concerned with global warming, that's a problem, because companies are going to be affected by global warming. Today, insurance companies are already understanding that they need to deal with global warming. If you are insuring a company and you're insuring people along the coastal areas, you better be concerned about that, or you're an abrogation of your fiscal responsibility.
Well, they're not going to insure.
Well, they may or may not, but 50% of the world's population lives on coast these days.
Yeah, they won't be able to get, like a lot of the companies in Florida after Hurricane Andrew, if you're at a mile of the beach, you can't buy insurance.
Right, but we're not just talking about people who live on the beaches. We're talking about Florida.
Yeah, right.
And New York City.
In Colorado.
All of Florida.
Yeah, they were pulling out.
There's no.
Have to be on the beach.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Colorado,
There is
it's
no-
the same thing.
yeah.
With forest fires. Now this year they've marked zones that are fire zones and flood zones. And if you're within so many miles of those, they won't touch you.
They're not. Well, and look what happened in Seattle just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, same thing.
So these and that comes about because of these wild weather patterns where you get much more rain than you used to get, dropped in a very short period of time. By the way, the reason you get desertification is the rain, those big, huge storms, suck the moisture out of the air that might have gone to other parts of the country. And so some parts of the country are getting those massive downpours, where other parts are not getting enough rain. California has had a drought. It's only had some rain recently, but when I was out there in February, it had a 7-year drought, which is one of the worst that they had experienced in in times of record keeping, and to the point where they were concerned about where the water this summer was going to come from. Now, I don't know if that's changed or not since I was out there, but these are just looking at them graphically like this, we can get the sense of what the pattern is, and they're disturbing patterns that when we start to think about the system, we might be concerned if we want to know. So I love this cartoon, and I don't know if you can see it from the back, so I'll read it to you. This is, how many of you remember Calvin and Hobbes? Okay, so Hobbes is pushing Calvin, and he says, "It's true, Hobbes. Ignorance is bliss." Then he says, once you start seeing things, once you know things, you start seeing problems everywhere. That's me, Cassandra. And once you see the problems, you feel like you ought to try to fix them. And fixing problems seems to require personal change. And change means doing things that aren't fun. I say, buoy to that. Then they're heading down the cliff, the hill here. But if you're willfully stupid and you don't know any better, you can keep doing whatever you like. Business as usual. The secret to happiness is short-term self-interest. Hobbes going, we're headed for that cliff. Calvin says, I don't want to know. Willfully blind, right? They go off the cliff. Hobbes says, I'm not sure I can stand so much bliss. Calvin says, careful, you don't want to learn anything from this.
I actually using the same cartoon in my class, talking about making changes and continuous improvement.
Do you? I love this cartoon. I found it on the web. Calvin and Hobbes, I mean, for Diane, there's some great ones on ethics.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you
I'll
should.
check it out.
Yeah, you should look. But and I'm just so sorry he's not producing these anymore because my son used to love these, so I sort of got familiar with some of them. But this is the situation that we're in if we keep our blinders on and don't think about the nature and of the system that we've created and what its implications are for the future of humanity. So when I talk about stewardship of the future, I'm really trying to think, how do we create a system where we can actually manage better for the future? So the problem for stewardship of the future is, here are all the skeptics. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Here on the sign, energy independence, preserve rainforests, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, renewables, clean water, air, healthy children, etc. What if we do that for nothing? I have another cartoon. I don't think I have it in here. No, I don't. So what is stewardship? Well, Peter Block wrote a wonderful book about stewardship when he was talking about companies. And he talks about stewardship as, in definitions in dictionaries and the like too, we'll also talk about it this way. It means to hold something in trust for another. I'm going to argue that responsible leadership, as we define it today, is stewardship of planetary resources for the well-being, or in trust for the well-being of the future of humanity and other living creatures on the planet now and in the future. And I say other living creatures because if we begin to think systemically, we realize that everything's connected. There's a wonderful book by Fritjof Capra, who's a physicist, called The Web of Life. And in that, it's a very short little book, and it's very accessible. And but he demonstrates so vividly that everything is connected to everything else. And if we understand that, then when species die, maybe that one species doesn't affect us directly, or at least we can't see the direct link to us. But as enough species die, as enough resources are used up, as we push ecosystems to collapse, if fisheries begin to collapse, about a fifth of the world relies on fish for their main source of protein. If fisheries really do collapse, we push them over the edge, then we have problems that begin to affect all of us, because then people will start to starve to death, and it just won't be a very pretty place. In fact, Paul Gilding has a book called The Great Disruption, and he's I think he's an ecologist, and he argues that. So you were talking before about, I'm sorry, I forget your name. John was saying humans are very resourceful, and he argues that too, actually. But humans are very resourceful in the face of an emergency or a crisis. So a disaster happens, some horrible thing. The Boston Marathon, we just had the marathon the day before I came. Last year at the marathon, as you probably heard, there were bomb explosions. People jumped in and rescued people. People tore off their clothing, put tourniquets on people. I mean, apparently, wasn't there, but there was blood everywhere. It was just a nightmare. But people leaped in. No one who wasn't dead at the scene and made it to a hospital died, because people leapt into the circumstance and were able to save the victims. Strangers. So we're very good in situations like that, where adrenaline kicks in and an emergency response is called for. We are really bad at recognizing and responding to slow-moving situations. So how many of you use the parable of the frog in boiled water? We're like the frog in boiled. How many of you have not heard that parable? So the parable of the frog is that if you take a frog and you drop it into a pot of boiling water, it will go, oh my God, it's hot in here, and jump out, right? It'll save itself. But if you put it in a cold pot of water and you turn the heat up under the water and warm it up gradually to boiling, the frog will boil to death. So human responses to long-term, slowly building crises, which is what the sustainability crisis, broadly defined, is more like the frog in the cold water. And so that's why an argument for understanding that and taking care now of planetary resources so that we don't become the boiled frog, literally, with climate change, or that we're not heading off that cliff ecologically. I mean, I actually talk about heading off an ecological cliff. And I think you can do that with climate, say that with climate skeptics as well as people who understand the climate science. Because sustainability has got to do with the use of resources, and we're using them up faster than the planet can replace them. It now requires 1.5 Earths of renewable resources every year. By about, I think it's about August or September now, we've used up by about August, we've used up 1 year's supply of earthly renewable resources. So from August on, or September on, whatever the date is, we're basically drawing on banked resources, if you will, if you want to think about it like that. So the Earth there's lots of resources in the Earth, right? And so, but every year we're drawing down from those stored resources. So it's like you've got money in the bank and you're living beyond your means. And you can do that for a period of time. Depends how much resource you've built up in the bank. But you can't do it forever because your money isn't going to last forever. So if you live too much beyond your means, too fast, then you use up those resources faster. And that's the situation that humanity is in with respect to renewable resources on the planet. And of course, non-renewables are not renewable by definition. So it requires a mindset change, or what one of the people I've interviewed for the Intellectual Shamans book talked about, heart set change. Because it's about valuing things, and it's about valuing things that go beyond the thing we seem to put most value in our economy today, which is money, financial rewards, and growth. So when I argue that the problem of growth is growth is a construct that was kind of constructed after World War II. So you had all the soldiers coming back from the war, and the economy had seen that when the Depression was on, the economy was sort of a chart that followed how the economy was working too, right? There wasn't much productivity. There wasn't a lot of growth during the period before World War II. So after World War II, planners were saying, well, we need to think about how to get the economy growing. And this notion that we have to always have our economy growing got really kind of embedded in all of our psyche. Because in human beings, there's always this sense of wanting more and wanting more innovation and wanting stuff, I guess. I don't know if any of you use the story of stuff in your classes. It's a 20-minute video. It's great. It helps to show anyone, us students. It was very insightful for me. I found it very enlightening. I use it in a lot of my classes now. And it takes us through the current system, the business as usual system. It's available free online. Story of stuff. There's story of water. There's story of electronics. And there's story of something else. But I can't remember at the moment. They're all free. Story of change. How do we actually begin to think about changing the system? But the idea is we have a linear production system now, but we live in a world in which, in nature, waste equals food. It's an ecological principle that was popularized by Paul Hawken. Waste equals food. So what is waste to one system becomes food in another system. But our system takes raw materials, produces something out of them, often with toxic chemicals associated with it, sells it, and disposes of it. And we're in landfill. Right? This is the worst, one of the worst examples. I try not to use these.
We're corrupting you.
You're corrupting me. So, you know, I have my students do a little exercise where I ask them to take products. So I have, one of the products I inevitably have in the classroom is somebody has a bottle of water, right? So I take that. And I'll take a cell phone. Everybody has cell phones. And then a couple other things, often a banana, because I love bananas. And they're good because bananas may disappear within 10 years, as we know them. And I ask them to do an exercise where they look at take their object in groups and figure out where it came from. Figure out what it's doing in society, what the production systems necessary to create it were. What does it do for us in society, and what's its useful life, and then what happens to it. So you take something like this. What's the average, once it's in my hands, what's the average sort of useful life of this product? Maybe half an hour. You know, if I'm drinking it slowly, maybe an hour. Maybe I don't finish it. Then what?
In the landfill.
Into the landfill. Because very, very small proportion of these get recycled, even though they are recyclable. Very small. So there are great pictures if you go on the web of huge numbers of bottles. You know that you pay 2,000 times more for this water than you would pay if you took water out of the tap? Can you think of any other product that you would pay 2,000 times more for something? I'm assuming the water here is pretty good, right?
Hog farm runoff, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe not. Or yeah, that's true. Or you filter it and get that stuff out. Yeah,
That's a cost too.
That's a cost too, but it's not this cost.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's a cost too. But
didn't it say most of bottled waters are actually from tap water?
it's tap water.
Yeah, it is.
It's tap water. So it's the same water, and you're paying, what are you paying 2,000 times, or 1,000 to 2,000 times more for? Convenience? Marketing, branding, that label, right? Why did bottled water in this country, where we have decent water supplies, become part of business as usual?
By the way, only 20% of water bottles got recycled. 20%.
I think it's less than that. I think it's closer to 10%.
Somebody would have told my father a number of years ago that one day people would pay $2 for a plastic bottle of water. He did not worry about it.
But we were talking about that yesterday. I said it's amazing you can take commodity products and sell it. You know,
Yeah,
if it's
you
packaged-
brand it.
if
You
it's
brand
packaged
it.
right,
It's Dasani or Aquafina.
salt, sugar,
Yeah,
and jack the price to the roof.
absolutely. And so,
Think of how many jobs that creates. Goes back to your other issue.
it does go back to the other issue. We need to rethink the system. And I don't have all the answers to how to rethink the system, but we need to rethink the system.
Sandra,
Yeah.
isn't there an island in the Pacific of plastic discard the size of Texas?
Yes,
Oh, that's what I
but it's
thought.
been building for years.
Yeah.
It's not just plastic.
Oh.
It's everything.
It's
Yeah,
everything.
it's not an island. It's a dead zone in the sea, I think. So one of
Form.
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
But
one.
it's been going for, I think, 100 years. Yeah, it's been a while.
So we take our stuff and we throw it out. Tom Friedman says there is no more away. There's no more over there. We put it over there, but there is no more over there. It's a global world, and over there is somebody else's property or place where they live and are trying to live a decent life. These got created because people began to realize the problem with, what are you drinking? Coca-Cola. Some Diet Coke. Oh, Dr. Pepper has a lot of sugar in it, right? Or Coca-Cola, regular Coca-Cola, has a lot of sugar in it. People start saying, not so good for you. Sugar really is,
They're not saying that to the diet ones.
chemicals, right? Right. But water is actually good for you, so we can
That's what
So-
Pepsi and Coke are banking on right now.
Absolutely. So we're not selling so much soda with sugar water. That's what they're selling us. We're not selling so much of that. So let's bottle water and charge huge amounts of money for it. Okay, good. Sounds like a plan to me. And by the way, we'll have all these plastic bottles to deal with, and then, yeah, there's some jobs associated with that. Anyway, so if we need this heart set, mindset change, where does change come from? So, I think there's a couple theories of change. And one I heard George, the same people I talked about before, Bob Eccles and George Silverman had this little article where they talk about you only need to change about 1,020 minds in order to reform the world. So they said, that was my reaction
Like the
to it.
100th monkey kind of thing?
No, it's the CEOs of the world's largest 1,000 corporations and the leaders of the world's largest economies, 20 economies. So with 1,020, if you could change their minds about the sustainability crisis and get them to act on that and drive that through their entities, whatever countries or companies, you'd be on your way to changing the world. The problem with that thinking is that those are the very people who are benefiting from the system. They're the 0.001%, right? In many situations. And they're benefiting from the system, and they are in many ways kind of separate. They live in separate communities. They're not part of the day-to-day. That I haven't actually watched that, but that show where I've heard about it, where that CEO goes into Undercover Boss, and how often their eyes are open because they really don't know what their workers are going through. They really don't get it.
It's a pretty cool show.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Yes.
But so they're divorced from it. So how likely is changing? I think it's a great idea. I wish we could change those minds. And then they'd change the reward systems in their companies, and they'd change the priorities of their companies and drive that kind of change down through their companies and really think about stewarding the future in a very different way. Wish that would happen. Okay, that's one theory of change, top down. The other is kind of bottom up. And bottom up says, look, we've got all these new types of businesses arising. Some of you are teaching about social enterprise or social entrepreneurships. Companies that are built from the start with multiple bottom lines, or this new type of company called B Corporation, which has built into its genetics, its DNA, a stakeholder orientation and a multiple bottom line orientation, and responsibility and transparency. What I call the arts of corporate responsibility: accountability, responsibility, transparency, and sustainability. We're really built right in. And we're seeing a lot more of that kind of activity. We're seeing many states now with laws on their books that legally permit companies to pay attention to more than one stakeholder or to have multiple bottom lines. By the way, there is no law anywhere that says companies have to maximize shareholder wealth. We all think there is. No, I know.
But at the end of the day, though, I need to be able to pay my bills if I start a business.
Absolutely.
And I need to pay my bills on top of being able to compete with my competitors who may or may not be watching out for the same thing that I am. So how do I balance being socially responsible with I need to keep my business going in order to feed me, my family, and my employees?
Right. So two types of responses to that. One is you're assuming that being more responsible is more costly.
Well, okay. So
That's what.
So if I price in my externalities, like the external.
Oh yeah,
costs,
if you price in your externalities, you will be at a competitive disadvantage.
exactly, right?
Which is why we need a regulatory structure around business to put everybody on a level playing field.
So,
Right?
so the externalities do need to be priced in.
Absolutely.
So now there's no that the stewardship isn't really based on the firm itself, but rather it's more on regulators.
So again, it's a wicked problem.
Yes, no, yes.
That's a great question.
I agree.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not either or. It's got to be both and.
Okay.
So you need a change in regulatory policy so that your company, when you decide to be more responsible and incorporate externalized costs, because those are real costs, right? But I want to argue in a minute that being more responsible isn't necessarily more costly. But if you decide to internalize your costs, all those externalized costs, you are going to be putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage unless the regulations change so that everybody has to do that,
Okay.
which is partly where we need to go. So one response to your original statement is, let's not necessarily assume that being more responsible is more costly. What if it's actually beneficial to your company? So there's been some research by Raj Sisodia, among other people. So who's in marketing here? Yeah. Firms of Endearment, his book Firms of Endearment. And they studied companies that treated their stakeholders better. And they found that those companies significantly outperformed other companies. I've found some similar things in my research. My latest research, which we are having a real struggle to get published because there's been hundreds of studies in the area of social financial performance. This is my last study looking at this because I'm not interested in more. But it's a neutral relationship. If you control for all the risks that companies have, so there's no trade-off. There isn't a trade-off. And there may be benefits. There could be reputational benefits. There could be retention benefits for employees and customers. There could be other kinds of benefits that are non-tangible. And much of companies' total assets these days.
Postpone this so it doesn't shut off.
Oh, okay. Much of companies' intangible assets these days are in intangibles, like reputation and brand. I mean, that's why Coca-Cola, I think it's Coke that produces Dasani, can sell us, because they got the branding. They got the branding stuff down. They got it down pat. So I had two responses to your original comment. One was there's not necessarily a trade-off, and I can't remember what the other one was.
Regulatory.
No. The point is about, I don't remember. But I would also say that there are values that go beyond financial values that we need to be taking into account. But I had another response, and maybe it will come back to me.
Just to follow up on your discussion about no trade-off, if you would like to define social responsibility by including manufacturing sustainability as well, there are plenty of studies. For example, one by Michael Porter. You guys will like. He has an article in Harvard Business Review back to early 1980s. So he has some theory, and then he made some observations from some companies, proving that if you're doing things right, then there will be no waste in resource. There will be no produces of the pollutions or the wasted energies. And in fact, by doing that, then your cost will go down. And then you will be better off in terms of sustainability, in terms of cost as well. So they have been proven evidence in terms of no trade-off, in terms of sustainability.
Yes, Porter also much more recently, has written about something he calls shared value. Shared value, which which is the stuff Diane and I have been working on for 30 years. But Michael Porter says it's like God said it. So it's printed in the Harvard Business Review, so it must be right. And so, if I say it, doesn't matter. But it's basically, Jed Emerson calls it blended value. And it's the idea of the both and, that you produce social and financial value. I did want to say about Lynn Stout has a book out called The Myth of Shareholder Value, in which she's a legal scholar, and she demonstrates that there is no legal basis for maximizing shareholder wealth. In fact, the whole notion came about because of a kind of a side opinion in a case that doesn't really have legal standing.
No, it's not that you need to maximize shareholder wealth. But rather, if I were an investor, why would I give you my money if I'm not going to realize a higher return?
Ah. So what? So okay. I remembered my other argument. So let me just say, one is that you might be what we call a social investor. So maybe 10% of the investor community cares about something other than immediate financial returns. They care how their money is being used. So and they invest their money accordingly. In fact, when I went to my TIA-CREF financial advisor, and I said, I want to invest in, portion of, not all of my money, but portion of it in the social. Are you sure you really want to? I'm like, yeah. Right, I do. Oh, it's not got to do with maximizing. No.
So that's more of a charity.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you're letting them use your money and not realize the gain that you otherwise couldn't have. So it's kind of like you're doing
It's not charity. I'm doing just as well in that fund
Yeah,
as
you're still making money, it's just not the same rate of return.
yeah, and you might not be having the trade-off that you think you are, because there's pretty much evidence that suggests that there really isn't that trade-off. The other thing I wanted to say before to your comment is, so we assume that the purpose of the firm is what?
maximize shareholder wealth.
To maximize shareholder wealth. Yeah. Yes, we all assume that, and that's what we teach our students. Right?
Yes, finance people will say.
That's what the finance people
I say the social responsible manner.
Yes, yeah.
Always
So
have that on there.
yeah, so why else would?
Why else would, so has anyone actually started a business? Ever?
Oh, well, I did.
I've been involved with
You've been what?
different startups.
You've been what?
I said I've been involved in 2 different startups.
2 different startups. Yeah, and they started to maximize shareholder wealth?
We thought we were going to, but
Yeah.
we didn't do a very good
You
job.
didn't do a very good job of it.
No, that's why.
What were the businesses?
The idea.
And
One was a communication business,
okay.
and the other was a software business.
So the purpose of the business was to maximize shareholder wealth?
I would say so, yeah.
Maybe that's why you didn't do so well.
No, we didn't, because we didn't maximize shareholder wealth.
I
Satisfied.
don't recall Adam Smith talking about that at all in Wealth of Nations. I don't remember it mentioned,
No. Well, corporations didn't exist as we know it.
Yeah, that's
But,
true. But in,
and he was talking about a situation in which there really were many suppliers, many
yeah.
producers who could maybe find a temporary equilibrium. But, so if my purpose, so I need profits to survive. I'm not going to disagree with you. I mean, I think that's your fundamental point. In order to pay the family, or the owners, in order to, give them back something for their investment, you need to give them some return on their investment. In order to pay your salary and your employees' salaries, you need to have return. In order to reinvest in the business, you need to have some return. No one is questioning that. Whether the purpose of your business is to maximize shareholder wealth is a different question. Right? So I need red blood cells. I'm using Ed Freeman's example here, okay? I'm stealing it. I need red blood cells to survive, right? I have to produce red blood cells or I'm going to die. Yeah? Right?
Yes.
Is the purpose of my life to produce red blood cells?
Well, see, but
Yes.
I work.
Yes?
Yes.
The purpose of your life is to produce red blood cells.
Yes.
What are you doing here?
I'm working to get money so that I can buy food at Dillon's in order to eat correctly to keep those blood cells going.
And that's
Only my purpose.
From the mouth of a marketing person. We got sport info.
There you go. So you got agreement. Is your purpose in life to produce red blood cells?
I would not say so.
But no.
But in terms of biological purposes, it's
Yeah.
one of
It's a need. We all need to. We need to do a lot of other. We need lymph and all this other stuff.
Yeah, I say the purpose of the business is to satisfy people's needs and wants while making a profit in a socially responsible manner.
Yeah.
And it's not just shareholders, there's stakeholders, which goes way beyond shareholders.
So
You gotta think broadly on stakeholders.
yeah, you do. And so
You know it's your business damaging stuff, you want it to improve
What,
life.
but my thought, as a business, the only reason I would go to a business, start a business, is to make money. nothing else. There's no self-actualization. There's no other purpose rather than to make money. Because if I want to, my purpose in life is not to make money. My purpose in life is I want to enjoy my life. I want to enjoy my family. I need money in order to do the
Yeah,
other
but
stuff.
you don't want to do it at the expense of others.
No, but work is the side stuff that I have to do in order to do the stuff that I want to do.
So if you're going to create a business,
Yes.
and you too,
When you're not at Dillon's.
And I've started several businesses, none of which are very prominent at all, but I've never started one to maximize.
But you started to make money, right? So
why did you start your
But you
businesses?
wouldn't start it if you thought, if I do this, I'm going in the hole.
Yeah.
No, you wouldn't do that, because you need, like I said, you need profits in order to sustain the business and everybody associated with it.
And you can argue that
Yeah,
some,
because I thought I would enjoy it, because I thought I would learn, and actually to build relationships, because I had opportunity to work with people I cared about.
you can argue that some individuals would
It
start a
was.
business for their
I mean,
personal,
we bought and
priorities.
sold.
Oh, okay.
whatever they might be.
Right.
But when you go from that point to being a steward of your investor's investment, your shareholder's investment, then it's a different story. Because now you're not doing it for your own, from a management perspective, from your own self-actualization or your own desires to improve the planet or whatever reason you want to have that business. You're doing it on behalf of those shareholders which have trusted their money with you to try and maximize that investment.
And these,
Because that's what-
and these flash traders, are they your owners? Are they your?
No, I agree, there's a whole distortion going on
70% of the
there.
market
There's
today.
no question about that.
Right.
Because they're not adding any value, I agree, they're just
But
skimming off.
but if you start a business,
I'm talking about the owners of the business.
but if you start a business and you want it to be successful, right?
Yeah, well,
Long term, you have to go out there and find something that somebody wants and produce that thing for somebody, whether it's a service or a product. And in order to make the business successful, you have to serve that purpose, and that's a purpose. The profits that come are a byproduct of doing that. Just like my red blood cells are a byproduct of me eating, and going out and doing something that I hope is somewhat more meaningful. I mean, we're all teachers, so hopefully we at least think that our teaching has some meaning and that educating young people has some value in the world, and that we're doing that for, not just to produce red blood cells, but because we all want to, at some level, make a contribution, and businesses too. Yeah, Kingsley.
We take a different approach from what we are discussing. Look at business, enterprise like General Motors. I equate the general manager or the CEO as a coach of basketball, football. What happens to the coach if he's not winning his games? What happens to the CEO if he's not generating profit for the shareholders?
They'd be fired, right?
All of them will go.
They retire to a very nice life.
Yeah, we have a distorted system. We have a distorted system these days.
They have
But in
to figure
theory,
out which one of their many
yes.
homes are going to
Right.
Every coach that has a long-winning season is likely to be fired. And the CEO that is not maximizing shareholders' wealth will be fired.
In the system that we have
The
today.
stakeholders has little influence whether a coach or a CEO will be